Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. If you're nervous to fly right now, you're likely not alone. The last 2 months have been marked by a string of airplane crashes and incidents. In January, an American Airlines aircraft collided with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter at Reagan Washington National Airport. All 67 people on both aircraft died. It was the first time in 15 years that a U.S. airline had a fatal crash. 2 days later, a MEDEVAC jet nosedived onto a busy Philadelphia street. The plane exploded. 7 people died. Then in Toronto, a Delta aircraft crashed and flipped. It skidded down the tarmac upside down before coming to a stop. No one died, but the crash left 21 people injured. Now, these are just some recent high-profile incidents that have captured headlines and deepened people's anxieties about flying right now.
And Robin, this year so far, there have been 19 fatal accidents in the skies. That's according to data from the National Transportation Safety Board. And now those numbers are actually lower than the same time period for 2024 and for 2023. So how safe is it to fly right now? And could it become less safe given the Trump administration's recent firings of hundreds of FAA employees? Here to discuss all this is Daniel Bubb. He's a former airline pilot, an aviation historian, and a professor of history and politics at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Professor Bubb, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning, Tia and Robin. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So before we get into some of the plane crashes and recent incidents we've just discussed, let's start with the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. That was a defining moment for the airline industry.
Yes, it sure was. What it did is it lowered fares and enabled lower fare carriers to enter the industry, because prior to that time, there were about 5 major carriers that were dominating about 80 to 90% of the market, and fares were relatively expensive. So when President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act on October 31st of 1978, that brought in a lot of other airlines, which increased competition. It required these major carriers to lower their fares so that more people could fly. And that, of course, increased the demand for air travel and also put some stress on our air traffic system and a need for more air traffic controllers and a way for airlines and the air traffic control system to handle this increased demand.
And now, despite the number of air carriers shrinking so dramatically in recent years, the number of aircraft in American airspace is higher than ever. So what's sparked this huge rise, and has it made incidents in the air more likely?
So some people call it COVID-19 air travel, kind of retaliation, where people want to fly, but they couldn't because many of us were isolated in our homes because of COVID-19. And so people basically save their money and then they want to fly and they still want to fly. So air travel demand remains very high. But I think one very important thing for people to keep in mind is think of the thousands of flights that happen every single day where nothing goes wrong. And I think that's testament to the strength of our air traffic system. It's not perfect. It needs improvement. But overall, we seem to be doing pretty well.
And we're actually going to chat with an air traffic controller a little bit later on the show. But Professor Bubb, that brings us to recent plane crashes, the fatal collision in January between an American Airlines aircraft and a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter at Reagan Washington National Airport. It did kill 67 people. And it was the first time in 15 years we saw a commercial crash of this magnitude. So what was going through your mind when you learned about it?
So the thing that was going through my mind is, first, as I tell everybody, no matter who is involved in any crash or any incident, is be sure to wait for the NTSB report to come out, because the NTSB investigators, the FAA investigators, have access to data and equipment that we don't. And so lots of times they can determine, what happened to very, fine detail, whereas we can't. And so I would just caution everybody to, first of all, wait until the NTSB report comes out, and it could take months, perhaps even a couple of years. So we have to be patient. But based on the little tidbits that I've seen that the NTSB released, it sounds like there was a little bit of kind of what we call stepping on each other with the aircraft microphone between the Black Hawk helicopter pilot and the air traffic controller. And so it sounded like they missed a critical communication or instruction there, which sounds like it contributed to this particular crash.
It was just a cascading effect of errors that happened.
Yeah. And any pilot will tell you that Reagan Airport airspace is incredibly congested. It's very busy. You have a lot of commercial aircraft coming into the airport. You have a lot of helicopters flying at low altitudes. And so it's just a very busy, very kind of highly stressed air traffic system there. And the idea behind building Dulles Airport was to really prompt the closing of Reagan National Airport. But because Congress finds Reagan Airport to be so convenient and they wanted to keep it open, that's what they've been doing. So we're going to have to figure out a way to really change the air traffic system around Reagan to basically make it safer.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking about some recent high-profile plane crashes in the U.S. Our guest is Daniel Bubb. He's a former airline pilot, an aviation historian, and a professor of politics and history at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Professor Bubb, now you believe the airline industry does need a major overhaul to keep people safe and to keep costs down. What should that look like? So
I think one of the first things that happened is the need. For quite some time, we had a shortage of pilots. And it sounds from the what I've heard in the most recent statistics that I have seen is that we've done a really good job of filling those positions. Some airlines, in fact, are not hiring anymore right now because their classes are full. They're training their pilots. So I think in that regard, that was really kind of step number one. Step number two is trying to figure out how to make our air traffic system even safer. Even though air traffic control classes are full right now, we're still short 1,800 air traffic controllers, which concerns me because that puts added stress on air traffic controllers. They work overtime, they work 6-day shifts, and you start getting into a very critical factor there, which is fatigue, and that can be very dangerous. So I'm concerned with the Trump administration placing a freeze on federal hiring. That means that we may not be able to fill the rest of those positions anytime soon, which is very concerning to me.
What about the industry itself? I'm thinking about airline staff pilots. I'm thinking about when I worked as part of an airline ground crew in Wyoming, and the airport there was surrounded by mountains. It was located in a national park, and that meant we saw some very dramatic weather. But many of the pilots seemed resolved to land those planes. I would open up the aircraft and see some bloodshot, weary eyes of the pilots after they landed in bad weather. And for me as a ground crew worker, I felt the pressure from the airlines to send planes off on time. So I can only imagine the pressure pilots were feeling to land aircraft.
There is a considerable pressure. I mean, if you think about it, also being a commercial pilot is a stressful job because you have to safely get your passengers from point A to point B. And there are days when you're going to have flight delays, particularly if you have inclement weather. That adds to a very long day. That's why the FAA has a requirement for what they call crew rest. You can't fly more than 8 hours for your particular shift. It's mandatory rest for really good reasons. So that's why the FAA has done that. And it's also imperative upon the captain of that particular flight to determine, whether it's safe to fly. Maybe the crew is really pushing up close against that crew rest mandatory time constraint and may end up delaying or canceling the flight, which is entirely up to their discretion because at the end of the day, the captain is responsible for everything that happens on that flight.
That's right. And there are widespread effects then for other crew members as well, who also are responsible for passenger safety. I realize that statistically speaking, you believe it is still extremely safe to fly. But I wonder, do you worry then it could become less safe? You mentioned the Trump administration's firing of FAA workers and the fact that we are so short-staffed as a country when it comes to air traffic controllers.
I still think the air travel remains very safe, and I would still encourage people to fly for a couple of reasons. First, you have the best trained pilots who are flying those commercial aircraft. You have the best air traffic controllers working the air traffic system. So I think the air traffic system will remain safe. It'll be very safe to fly. However, I would encourage the Trump administration to really consider filling those positions just so that we're not placing unneeded stress, additional stress on air traffic controllers because it already is a very stressful job. So I would encourage them to think about ways to, hire more air traffic controllers, which I suspect they're doing because I know Sean Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation, has been working on that. So I think they'll do it. It's just going to take time. The other thing, too, that I think is important for people to remember is it takes a little bit of time for air traffic controllers to become experienced. Somebody might go through a 2-year air traffic control program, but they're not going to be put in a major busy airport like Detroit Wayne International Airport. They're probably going to work at a small airport, or they might work at what we call a center and a TRACON, where it's not so busy, it's not so stressful, and they have to build that proficiency and demonstrate it before they're able to work in busier airports.
We'll be speaking with a former air traffic controller next to get more of a view inside the tower. So thank you for helping our ascent into that discussion. Professor Daniel Bubb is a former airline pilot and aviation historian, and he teaches politics and history at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Professor Bubb, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Coming up on the Metro, we'll get a view inside the air traffic control tower with a former FAA employee. We're talking aviation in America after a string of recent high-profile plane crashes in the U.S., and it has us wondering, have you flown recently? Was your experience a pleasant one? Are you afraid to fly? Give us a call. The number is 313-577-1019. Stay right there with us on the Metro. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And if you're afraid to fly right now, you are not alone. An alarming rash of crashes and close calls, many of which were captured on video, have raised concerns about the airline industry's safety and reliability. So far this year, there have been 19 fatal accidents in the skies. That's according to data from the National Transportation Safety Board. Now, those numbers are actually lower than the same time period for 2024 and for 2023. But it's hard not to hear about the Washington, D.C. mid-air collision of a commercial plane and a U.S. Army helicopter and not feel some sort of fear. So we want to know, are you afraid to fly right now? Are you planning any trips in the near future, or have you flown recently? The number is 313-577-1019.
That's right, Tia, and we are curious about your experiences in the skies recently. The incidents in recent months have renewed calls for fixing staffing and outdated technology issues. Just yesterday, there was a congressional hearing on the matter where leaders of aviation safety and air traffic control associations urged Congress to help fix the staffing issues in aviation. They also pointed to Elon Musk and DOJ's firing of around 400 Federal Aviation Administration employees. Now, at that hearing, David Spiro, the president of Professional Aviation Safety Specialists, said the firings demoralize the workforce and jeopardize airline safety. And when a crash happens, one of the first people to get public scrutiny is the air traffic controller. So did they make a mistake? Were they too tired and overworked to do their job well? Those are the questions people are asking. And so we want to better understand the work that air traffic controllers do. Our guest today is Todd Yeary. He's a former air traffic controller. He did that work for 13 years. Todd, welcome to the Metro.
Good to be with you. Good morning.
Good morning. So you were an air traffic controller based in Chicago for 13 years. I'm wondering, what made you want to become an air traffic controller in the first place?
Well, in many ways, I didn't have much of a choice. I grew up in an air traffic control family. My father was an air traffic controller who was fired after the PATCO strike in 1981. My stepmother was a controller as well. And so over the period of time that I was with the FAA, once my father was rehired, we were probably three working in the same building in different areas. So
Todd, in some ways, we've got to pause on that for just a moment. I'm sorry to cut you off, but that's incredible. No, I mean, that doesn't sound like a very common situation. All three of you were working as air traffic controllers at one point.
At one point. And let's be clear, if you were to ask a regular person on the street, what does an air traffic controller do, they would think it's probably a ground guide on the tarmac at the airport who works for the airline.
I did that, Todd. I think it's very different.
I would have thought that. That's what I think. That's what I think. So thank you. Explain that for us, because that's what I personally thought.
My work was less consequential. Of course, I was responsible for telling the aircraft to stop, but I think
that's a big job.
I mean, yes, but I think the pilots, without me there, they might have been able to figure things out. I don't think I had quite as impactful of a job as you, Todd.
Well, don't miss it, right? Because when we think of air traffic control, it's not a person, it's a system.
That's right.
And so the system is the coordination of a number of interrelated systems that create a network that leads to the safe and efficient navigation of air travel for passengers and for goods in the United States. And so whether it's the ground guide on the tarmac, making sure that airplanes that are constantly moving in and out of gates, around baggage carts, fuel trucks, food service trucks, coordinating with air traffic control, all of this kind of is the dynamic interplay on the airports. And then when the airplanes are between their departure and their destination, keeping them safe in the skies. And so when a lot of times this gets oversimplified, like it's just some random person given some random instructions that are pretty simple to kind of comprehend, but it's a very dynamic, very complicated and complex scenario that happens moment by moment, day by day, 365 days a year.
Todd, I always was so struck working out on the tarmac, as a ramp worker, as we're called, and watching all of the machinations that you're describing right now, and every person in the role that they had to play, and watching it all work pretty harmoniously. But I saw the air traffic tower in the distance, and it was a place that I could never access or get to. It was rightfully protected and isolated. What was the training like to become an air traffic controller, and what surprised you about the skills and knowledge that's needed for the job?
Well, the training process is a somewhat long one, depending on the facility where you're assigned. And so depending on which airport you're working at, if you're working at a regional radar facility or a terminal radar approach control, as we call it, they navigate the aircraft to the immediate vicinity of the airport. That training can take quite a while. But let's start with the initial hire. Regardless of what pathway you find yourself to be an employee of the FAA, whether it's by taking the civil service exam, it's computer-based now, or if you come by the college training initiative, where some colleges have been designated for students to go through a curriculum, and at the end of the curriculum, they bypass the FAA Academy and go right to a facility. Once you get to the facility, The facility training is unique to that facility, and depending on the dynamics, some facilities are less complicated, less busy. Others are more complicated, more busy. That training timeline can run as short as a year, and a year is not short when we think about it, but as long as 3 or 4 years if you're in a regional air traffic control facility that's basically a big radar room. And so that process takes a while. You start out learning how to be an assistant controller. That's basically preparing or sharing flight plan information with the manual controllers who sit next to the radar controllers in a radar facility, all the way up to being a fully certified radar controller. And that's position by position. It's not one size fits all. And so depending on the complexity of the facility, it could literally take you a number of years to go from initial hire to being a certified professional controller, as we call them now, which is basically a fully certified controller who's able to work all of the positions in a particular area of responsibility.
Can you go a little bit more into, I mean, you have described many of the complex tasks that you face as an air traffic controller, but could you describe a typical day and put us into the shoes of an air traffic controller a little more?
I love it when folks ask me about a typical day in air traffic control, because the typical day in air traffic control is atypical. Even right now, it's raining on the East Coast. I'm in the Baltimore area. That changes your typical day, right? A typical day, an ideal day, is when the weather is clear, the surfaces are dry, there are no impediments or impacts on air traffic that allow you to get airplanes out and airplanes in on schedule. But a typical day is you may start with things being ideal. The weather can change and things change on a dime, right? Summertime, pop-up thunderstorms turn what is otherwise a routine day into, for lack of a better term, organized chaos, right? You're trying to manage the uncertainty because clouds don't predict where they're going to pop up. Lightning doesn't predict where it's going to strike, and you're relying on not only what you see on your radar, but what the pilots are telling you in real time. And so a typical day is a day that you start with some sense of how it should flow, but with an awareness that at any moment, for any reason, an aircraft lands, they lose power on the runway, you lose a runway. An airport on the other side of the country has a situation that affects what's going on where you are. The reality of air traffic control is the most predictable thing about air traffic control is every day is potentially unpredictable.
That is so true. It rings for me when I think back to my work for the airlines and how much we were at the mercy of weather and this domino effect of one, as we call it in the airline industry, one irregular operation, an IROP, and how that could affect the rest of the day, maybe the rest of the week. And it's one reason why, taking that first flight of the day is likely going to be a better option than waiting until later in the day because of that domino effect and how things across the system are affected. You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're talking about the state of flying right now after a string of high-profile crashes. Are you afraid to fly? Have you flown recently? What's been your experience? You can join the conversation right now, 313-577-1019, and we're going to the phone lines. We have Onita here in Detroit. Onita, are you afraid to fly right now?
So, am I afraid to fly right now, Tia? I've been flying by myself 50 years. I'm 56 years old, from Dayton, Ohio originally, and I'm always afraid to fly. I've been afraid to fly my entire life, but once you close the doors, I'm fine. Now, having said that, these recent crashes have heightened my fear, which I know is irrational. So I did fly from Houston back to Detroit on the day that the Toronto flight crashed. So there was a lot of unease with my party and with me because we're flying. The day we went, the Washington crash that just happened, and I used to fly out of National Airport all the time because I lived in D.C. 14 years. So now you see this on TV. Oh, my goodness, they're flying from National. That crash. And then you think of the crash many decades ago in D.C. So I'm always afraid. It is irrational, but we got word at the airport about that Toronto crash, and I was just afraid. The other thing is, once I get up in the air, I'm usually like, okay, go Dayton, because Dayton is the birthplace of the aviation of Orville and Wilbur Wright, and so I'm always better. But for me, the takeaway at the end, even at my age, is this, and you all were just talking about poetry. There's If I Must Die Tonight. I'm an English major from Howard University, and I studied poetry. And Claude McKay's poem was If We Must Die. So I'm always thinking when I get on that plane, if I should die, have I done everything right by the people? And really, that's it. So if I do go down in a crash or however I die, that's always my concern. So I was afraid. I'm just like, look, Lord, I got to get back to Detroit. I got some stuff to do. And I want to thank you all, Robin and Tia, for this question, because it's been in my head to ask people. So, yeah, thanks a lot, and go Dayton.
Nita, thank you so much for calling into the Metro today and sharing your concerns and your fears about flying, especially as they've heightened due to the crashes we've seen across the U.S. recently. And Todd, our guest right now, Todd Erie, a former air traffic control specialist with the Federal Aviation Administration, is here with us. Todd, how much does our awareness of crashes due to video capture contribute to the fears that Onita is talking about right now?
Well, it's a big deal. First thing I will say to Onita is H-U, and she would say, you know.
I wanted to say it, but I didn't go to Howard, so I couldn't say it.
Well, I have family that went to Howard, but when you live in the DMV, you got to know the routine.
Yeah.
The awareness of these incidents in such a vivid way, being able to see, for better, for worse, the midair collision at Reagan a month ago, that was kind of preceded by remembering what happened on 9/11. It was a day that I was working. I remember clearing the airspace. You could see the airplanes flying into the Twin Towers. Because our ability to have access to information is much faster than it has ever been, these things become not only brought to our awareness, but they make impressions in our mind. And so we replay them time and time again. I often contrast it to when I'm driving my car. If I'm coming up on an accident, it's interesting that traffic slows down to see what happened.
The gawkers, yeah.
And nobody stops to get out of their car to say, oh, my goodness, I saw a crash on the other side of the road, therefore I need to leave my car here. And so because we become familiar with certain types of engagements and accidents over time, we've normalized them. Aircraft incidents are not normal for us. 45,000 operations on average a day. Typically, most days go without any incidents. When you have an incident that is pronounced as Reagan or Philadelphia or Alaska or Toronto, those things stand out because they're not part of our day-to-day experience. And so what I would say to Onita is that air travel is still the safest mode of travel. It is safer than going to get out in your car right now and driving down the street. What I do when I get on a plane is I look to see where I'm sitting. I have confidence in the flight crew and the flight attendants who are there for safety. And like a baby in a car seat, when the engines start and the plane starts rolling, I'm probably going to sleep unless I'm pretending to do some work.
Pretended to do some work. So, Todd, I just want to stay with you right there, actually, and stay with the, September 11th, of course. You were talking about being an air traffic controller on 9/11. That was a very, very stressful time. I could only imagine. None of us could imagine. I was only in the 4th grade at the time when it happened. So what was it like working as an air traffic controller on 9/11? Could you talk about, you said when chaos happens, it just turns into complete chaos. What was it like?
Well, it was different. We didn't have a playbook. We had, typically in air traffic control training, you have these situations where you have a different kind of awareness. So if there is a hijacking, right, taking over of an airplane by an unauthorized person, you have a procedure. You don't have a procedure for hijacking simultaneously. What you also don't have is a need to clear the airspace arbitrarily as quickly as you can because you don't know what you're dealing with. We were forcing flights to land at the nearest airport, wherever they were along their route. The airport nearest them was the airport where they were going to have to land, whether they wanted to or not. And in many instances, to communicate the seriousness of the moment on that day, there were military aircraft that were scrambled all across the country in the event we needed to escort commercial aircraft to the ground because we couldn't tell whether or not there were more than 4 aircraft that had been commandeered by foreign parties. So we had to sterilize the airspace to try to figure out, are there any aircraft left that might be problematic when it comes to the safety not only of the flying public, but of people on the ground.
And just thinking about just in general, of course, 9/11 obviously was not a typical day, but you did the job for 13 years, which is something like 3,500 work days. How did you manage the stress of that job day in and day out?
So I think for a lot of us in the air traffic control arena, those of us who've done it for a number of years, once you get through the training, part of it is you kind of become hooked on the adrenaline. I ended up leaving because I was exploring other opportunities. I didn't have any issues in the field. I graduated third in my screen class at the academy. So I grew up in an air traffic family. So I could have stayed. As a matter of fact, my family looked at me sideways like, what, you're leaving to go teach at a university? You know, I'm a little different. But the reality is that of all of the jobs that I've had in my life, currently I practice law, I pastor a church in Baltimore, the most fun job I have ever had was that of air traffic control, hands down.
I just love that so very much. And I just want to say thank you to Onita, who gave us a call a little bit earlier as well. The number is 313-577-1019. We'll continue our conversation with former air traffic controller Todd Yeary next.
Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And if you're afraid to fly right now, you are not alone. An alarming rash of crashes and close calls, many of which were captured on video, have raised concerns about the airline industry's safety and reliability. And it's hard not to see all of that and not feel some sort of fear right now. So we do want to know, are you afraid to fly? Are you planning any trips in the near future that have you a little nervous? The phone number is 313-577-1019. Now, Robin, are you afraid to fly right now? I know you have a certain level of knowledge and you understand the mechanisms of the way that it all works. So are you afraid?
I'm not afraid to fly, and I will say that working for the airlines for almost 10 years and seeing all the processes and protocols that are in place, all the checks and balances, it gave me a lot of confidence. And just as Todd Yeary, a former air traffic controller and our guest today, was saying, when he sits down in an aircraft, it's like he sits down like a little baby in their car seat. I feel similarly. I feel really relaxed, and I close my eyes and I go to sleep, and I get a deep sleep for at least a good 10 to 15 minutes until things start to awaken in the aircraft. But I will say that it is shocking to see these images, to see videos of crashes, to see these photos. And I remember, as part of the training that I did for the airlines, we studied all of the very serious crashes of the past. And we talked a lot about what went wrong and what new procedures and safety measures were in place to prevent that. So that makes me think as well that once we see these incident reports, once we understand what happened, that the industry will respond in kind, and we will see that they'll implement things if there need to be new things implemented to prevent another crash. But Tia, what about you? How are you feeling
I'm
about
more like
flying?
Onita. I'm a little bit like Onita. I've always been a little nervous, apprehensive when flying. It's just always something that just gets me a little nervous. So sleeping on a plane is out of the question for me. Hopefully they have a good movie lineup, good lunch.
Is that because you're too nervous?
I think so. I just never quite fall asleep on a plane. So I'm always just kind of nervous, as if I'm watching, as if I can do something. If something happens, like, what, I'm going to jump into action or something. I don't know. But I'm just always on alert on a plane. So these recent crashes have made me a little nervous. Hearing about what's going on federally at the federal level also makes me a little nervous about getting on a plane. We were just talking
the firings,
a little.
You mean the FAA firings?
The firings, yes, the FAA firings makes me a little nervous. Because there are so many levels to it, as we're learning. There's so many layers. One thing could cascade into just chaos, like we've been hearing from Todd. So it's just. I've been thinking about doing a lot of road trips this summer. And I know, and then we just hear that it's safer to fly than it is to drive.
Right.
So it's just like, I might just stay put.
Oh, no. I mean, please don't stay put. I want you to feed your adventurous spirit and nourish it. I mean, I do think that is a statistic or a point that we need to continue to repeat, which is that statistically speaking, it is still much, much safer to fly than it is to drive.
Than watching these planes. I've been in more personal, like fender benders in my car than I've seen plane crashes recently. So I think, like you're saying, as long as I have more information, I learn more, I think that'll help a lot of folks. Knowledge is power, so I think that'll help a lot of us.
That's right. But the incidents in recent months, they have renewed calls for fixing staffing, outdated technology issues. And just yesterday, there was a congressional hearing on the matter where leaders of aviation safety and air traffic control associations urged Congress to help fix the staffing issues in aviation. And this gets us to something that you're concerned about, Tia. They also pointed to Elon Musk and DOJ's firing of around 400 Federal Aviation Administration employees. At that hearing, David Spiro, the president of Professional Aviation Safety Specialists, said the firings demoralize the workforce and they jeopardize airline safety. And when a crash happens, it's true that one of the first folks who get public scrutiny are the air traffic controllers. We want to know, did they make a mistake? Were they too tired and overworked to do their job? And so that's one reason we have Todd Yeary joining us now. He's a former air traffic controller for 13 years. So, Todd, recent crashes and close calls, plus firings by Elon Musk's Doge, have brought renewed attention to the aviation industry. And just yesterday, as we mentioned, there was a congressional hearing on airline safety. And we're going to get to the present moment, but there has been a shortage of air traffic controllers for decades. And so that has me wondering, when did this air traffic controller shortage begin?
Well, it's a great question, and the short answer is in August of 1981, President Ronald Reagan fired all of the air traffic controllers, PATCO controllers, who had gone on strike. There had been a commitment to the controllers. Remember, my dad was a controller. He was a member of PATCO. I remember
and your
the
mama.
First vote that they took, and my mother and my stepmother, right? So it's a family business. I remember the first vote for deciding whether or not they were going to walk. And that was in 1980. And they decided not to go. The controllers decided not to go because there was a commitment from then candidate Reagan leading up to the November 1980 election that they would get the support of the union. After the election, things changed, and the union decided that wages and work conditions were not being addressed, and so they decided to go. At that point, the president, by executive action, fired all of the controllers. If they didn't have a status where they were on leave or whatever, they couldn't come back, and they were not going to be eligible for rehire. At that point, probably about 11,000 or so controllers were fired. So now you have an immediate issue where you have to make up an entire workforce in a short period of time, and you cannot replace a fully certified controller who leaves on Monday with someone that you hired off the street on Tuesday. It literally took most of a decade, if not more, to try to replace those fired controllers. I was in the last third, I believe, of the cohorts that were coming through. I hired on in 1989, and they were still trying to catch up. What then happens is, as you hire right after 1981, because there's a mandatory restriction on being able to control live traffic after the age of 56, you now have an attrition issue. And so as quickly as you're trying to hire them and train them, you also have to hire more on the front end to be able to offset these clusters of controllers that are not going to be eligible on the back end. And the agency has never caught up. Part of it is because the agency is funded by the federal government, and fights over the budget and what the priorities are have caused what I believe has been a lack of courage and commitment in some instances to fully fund the air traffic control function. Now, the FAA reauthorization of last year begins to kind of plug that gap. But again, you can't just go, get 1,000 eligible candidates and say, we're going to make you air traffic controllers and start controlling live traffic. If that were to happen, then I'm probably not getting in my seat and going to sleep when the airplane starts moving, because I understand just how much rigor comes with the training in a particular facility to get a controller to fully certified status. We haven't caught up yet. I think the testimony yesterday said we're still short 3,600 controllers from our optimal staffing levels. And so anything that disrupts our ability to maintain the system in the meantime has an adverse effect on efficiency and potentially safety, even if it's not air traffic controllers, but if it's tied to the air traffic control system, the facilities that we use, the equipment that we rely upon. All of those are factors that have to be considered. And so the firing of the probationary pass employees, if they were going to be trained to deal with the equipment and making sure that the equipment is functional and operational, that may not have an immediate impact. But if you're losing pass employees, fully certified technicians on the back end, and you don't have someone already ready, fully trained to go, eventually that's going to catch up. And Elon Musk and the group of geniuses that have been brought in, obviously they don't know much about air traffic control as a function at all. Otherwise, those firings would have never occurred.
Todd, so we can trace back the persistent shortage of air traffic controllers to Ronald Reagan, and you've talked about how there have been disputes within the federal government about how much to fund the FAA. This has me wondering, is this a partisan issue?
Well, absolutely not, right? I've never been on a flight. My first flight on the flight deck to observe what flight crews do was to fly into downtown airport in Detroit. As you remember, the inner city airports were landlocked. They're very compact, highly populated around the airport, and the runways were typically kind of short, right? So the first time I watched a crew go in, it changed my perspective about what pilots do, because they knew how to navigate airplanes, and the technology on airplanes was not what we now know them to be. This is the early 90s. But they still had a command of what's going on. And so when we start looking at these issues of funding and investing in air traffic control, there's always been this sense that until we have a bad enough issue, then there's no need to put a lot of money behind it. It's always been, it's not as modern as we want it to be, but the system is still the best in the world, so why invest in it? That's not going to cut it anymore. When the technology on the aircraft is more advanced than the technology in the towers and the radar centers, you have some incompatibility. And so there's going to be a lag that does not always lend itself to efficiency or safety. We got to be able to work that through. And until the Congress puts the money behind it, when air traffic control contributes to about 5% of the nation's GDP, air traffic control globally, about 4% to productivity globally, you cannot underinvest in what moves people and products every single day to be able to make sure that people have what they need and they get where they're going. That's not how you run a system.
Todd, I want to talk briefly about that congressional hearing yesterday that we've mentioned a few times. Dave Spiro, the president of a union representing employees of the Federal Aviation Administration, said the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, Elon Musk's department, fired essential employees without accounting for the impact their departure would have on the agency's functions. How long does it take to replace an air traffic controller?
Well, Mr. Sparrow was talking about the technical side. In both instances, depending on the facility and the function, it could take from a year to 3 years or longer to get completely through the training process. Equipment differs from facility to facility. Airspace differs from facility to facility. Traffic complexity differs from facility to facility. So it's not let's come up with a standardized training model, run everybody through it, and then put them on a sector with a headset and start talking to airplanes. That's not how it works. And so what he has raised is the issue that has been the issue for now 40 plus years, is that the disruption intentionally initiated by an executive in office has caused the reverberations and the ripple effect that we've not been able to resolve. And it's not an Elon Musk, it's not a tech thing, it's not go get some satellites and find some things. You're not going to be able to replace the human factor without another human factor. And until we address that, we're going to have challenges of efficiency, but I have no doubt that the full complement of controllers, the line controllers, and the safety specialists that work in this system every single day do everything they can to make sure that we have the safest, most efficient air traffic control system in the world, even when the technology is not as up to date as we would like it to be.
And Todd, why can't we replace the human element with computers?
Well, because weather is not computerized, number one. Number two, what's required, adjustments in timing. If a flight plan is off just a bit, if the winds delay the passing of an airplane over a particular piece of land or a marker, that alters the issue. And so remember, artificial intelligence is artificial in terms of how it functions, but it's based off of what is knowable. You can only know a certain number of scenarios before you run into the one thing that you had not factored in before, and now your artificial intelligence model is compromised. We saw it at Reagan, an issue where maybe an equipment malfunction. We don't know yet. We're waiting on the preliminary report from NTSB. Was there an issue on the Black Hawk? Was there something going on where situational awareness was not what we would have wanted it to be? There are a number of contributing factors that artificial intelligence does not do. And even artificial intelligence as it is used now will come up with what we often call ghost or false responses, because artificial intelligence is just that. It is artificial. You don't artificially fly. You don't artificially decide that you want to go from one place to another. That's a real-time, real-person, reality-driven experience, and you need a real-time, reality-driven program and process to be able to handle it. That's not an Elon Musk expertise. I don't care how bright the people are that work with him. I worked in this field. I did it. I grew up in it. The equipment I touched as a kid, I worked on as an adult. I know what it's like to have to work with equipment that is outdated, but I also know what it's like to put your best effort forward to make sure that everybody's expectation that they're going to get where they're going is achieved day in and day out.
And Todd Yeary, as a former air traffic controller for 13 years, briefly, very briefly, 30 seconds, how far does the technology need to progress to get to an acceptable level?
As far as is needed to meet ongoing and future demand. That's not a simple answer. It's an assessment answer.
Once again, Todd Yeary, a former air traffic controller for 13 years. Want to say thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today. Looking forward to chatting with you soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
This show is produced by Sam Corey, Carey Jr. II, and Jack Philbrandt. Our engineer is Nate Bender. Our senior producer is David Lyons. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.